the more that we can bring out what is in the contracts, they're not hidden away in a drawer, digitize it in some way, and then make sure that that process going forward is as smooth as possible. You're spending time on value conversations. You're spending time on transformational change.
Colin, you've done a lot with operating models. What do you think is key about sort of processes and operating models? What do you see as the most or the more successful organisations have done with their operating model?
I think clarity to begin with. Clear operating model. So if you layer on that diversity of services without a clear operating model, you're just stacking on chaos. Well, the service isn't quite right and I've got 29 people serving this bank branch and something goes wrong. Whether it's with the service at the time or forward looking and working together, if you've got you need to have a clear operating model. Who's doing what? So I think the first thing is clear governance about who owns what part of the relationship. And the other thing about the complexity of when these, your left-hand side of the bow tie, when these contracts are put together, lots of different groups putting them together. Now they're coming down to that knot. Now there's going to be sensitive information within the contract. So you can't just go, hey, everyone, there's the whole contract. So you need to share, need to know basis. What do you need to know? So be very clear. So have a clear operating model. Make sure people understand their roles, responsibilities. System is screaming. Who do I need to scream at? It could be screaming into the ecosystem. But if no one's picking it up, they don't know. And I think the best transformational change that, I've seen working with multiple organizations over the time is when you get that partnership, you get the groups working together. So one of the things that I always try and do is have a workshop, get everyone around the table. This is the vision. This is where we're going to. So everyone understands that big picture of where we're going to. They don't need to understand all the nuances of the contract that underpins where we're going. Here's our big system integrator. They're going to be leading the process and we're working with the parties that are working to put that in place. But everyone's there. So show that collaboration, show that partnership, and here's the governance, here's how we're going to run it. And I think have that openness and transparency about how we're going to do that. And I think to the point that you raised, the more that we can bring out what is in the contracts, they're not hidden away in a drawer, digitize it in some way, and then make sure that that process going forward is as smooth as possible. You're spending time on value conversations. You're spending time on transformational change. You're spending time on the business value that you articulated early on. And everyone's going, oh, why are we here? What are we doing? Oh, and not, why am I here? Everyone knows why they're here. And with that governance, you can take it away and bring it back together and it works better. And be open. So workshops, whether, you have to go away, every month we go away, every quarter we have a steer code, whatever it is, make sure you drive through that change. And if there is a system that's screaming, who needs to know? I know about it. So I think for me, we talked about early on, there is definitely a gap. Lots of complexity in the contracts that are put together, and it's not shared. So I've seen circumstances where, hey, we're the change program that's implementing the contract that's been put in. I don't even know what's in there. Well, how can you deliver success on the back of that if you don't know what you're obliged to do? And that leads to friction between the customer that's going, you're obliged to do this, are we? So you've got to be very clear on who's doing what, the obligations, and then track it through.
To your point that Richard made earlier around, it's about not being malicious at all, it's about not knowing. There's been multiple things in my career that I consistently come back to, all different roles, all different jobs. But a lot of the time it comes down to the basics being done right. And you mentioned like operating models, you mentioned process, mentioned clarity and responsibilities. A lot of teams that I see that potentially haven't sat down and just ever worked out the end-to-end of something, right? The end-to-end of a process, and then broke it up into its sub-process parts, and at least gone, well, you own that bit, right? I'm not going to tell you how to do your job, but you own that chunk of the life cycle. I own this chunk. Is there any gaps in the middle of it, right? Is that chunk to that chunk, is that the ones that should be next to each other and hand off accordingly? Because the problems that I see quite a lot are at that basic level, which is you've poorly defined something, you've got 10 process steps to something and you've got 7 and 8 are missing. So don't be surprised that it falls down when you get to that part of the process because you've not defined it. Back to the point I'm making about basics is time and time again I come back to What did the contract say? Was that a good written obligation? Was it acceptable to be put into the contract and then signed off? And then is it deliverable? If you have that kind of stream or thread running through it from pre to post, you kind of stop this problem from happening.
You do, provided, and there's one provided I would throw in there that is often forgotten about, I think, even right now today. People still talk about the major contracts in their supply chain and then the long tail. So when I was talking about the bank earlier and 700 to 800 suppliers, 600 of those will fit in what industry will call the long tail. And some can be very, very small, like Lokulus, like Brooklyn, relatively speaking, small organisations. But in this day and age of fintech technology, for instance, they are some of the most important that you've got. They're providing the AI or the bots that enable you to transfer funds, that enable you to deal in a new way in the market. There may be the technology that actually contains all of your contracts. If this went wrong, it's pretty important to your business. So no longer can you say, I've got 5 outsourcers and I spend 80% of my time making sure they're looking after my enterprise operating model correctly. You've now got to be consistent across just about every supplier. And it even works in the retail world. They'll still have their major suppliers and their infrastructure providers. But when pandemic came along, which was the most important, the people who had gel and the people who had masks, who were tiny little companies that they had to rely on very, very quickly to scale up. So what we're talking about in terms of process and automation and so on, it depends. Its importance depends now on how it's spread across the entire supply chain, not just the central part, because the value may come from something that's quite small. And no way, if you're in any, for instance, major bank, let's just say with those guys for a minute, can you afford to have vendor management across every single supplier in the 700 or 800 that you've got?
But very interestingly, the regulator is also aware that they need to manage it. You can't, and the security threats that we saw late last year, if you attack one of those suppliers and it goes, you need to manage. You need to know you need to know who they are. Yeah. You need to tier them. Who am I going to spend my time with? Yeah. You need to touch all of them, and you need a way of talking to them all. So to that point about who are my suppliers? What do they supply me with? And why? And then you come into the cost bit, which is at the end. Do I actually need this? But I think that the security threat and the ability to work across that is key. Know who they are, who are the contacts, absolutely. Have that touch point. And then, as I say, the regulators, as we know in the financial sector, you've got to know who is providing your services all the way through, even down to the tail there.
I think the supplier management discipline is quite unoptimised, right? So there's no standardisation around supplier management, right? So we've been looking to help try and change that with vendor ops, etc., and give it sort of a repeatable standard definition. But it's an industry that almost draws me back to the old days of when HR was called personnel, right? It's like, it's about people. It's HR's job. Or it's personnel's job because it's about people. And over time, it gets no, culturally, you need to be able to manage people and be able to be a people-aware person and aware of who you're managing. I think the same thing applies to a lot of disciplines today and supply management, which is you're not going to get a vendor manager for every contract, right? You've got to understand, and your organisation needs to put forward its standard blueprint of repeatable vendor management or supplier management or customer management, and you expect everyone to follow that guidance and those policies in the best way that they can, because it needs to be part of the frontline job. It needs to be day to day. We do a lot of people talking about a lot of risk management. And if you leave it up to risk managers, it's typically something that's crystallised. It's too late, or it's a near miss by the time it gets to a risk manager, because the risk managers don't work in the front line. They're not in the coalface, right? If you get that information down to the coalface and that structure and that software augmented help next to the person that's at the coalface that says, I think something's going a bit wrong here. You might want to look at it in this context, back to your Lokulus point about giving me the knowledge. Then you empower that person to go, oh yeah, okay, let's head it off.
To keep up with the latest Brooklyn vendor assurance news, subscribe here and follow us on LinkedIn and Twitter. Links in the description below.